Good afternoon, everyone. This is Corey from the National Weather Service office here in Bismarck. Just wanted to thank everybody for taking time out of your day to join us here for our webinar here this afternoon. Some of you might have attended our last webinar, climate webinar. That was back towards like the end of October or so. And during that one, we had a couple of questions where people were wondering if we might do an update at some point. And so based on that suggestion, we're sitting here today with the webinar again to kind of give you a kind of a late winter, midwinter update, kind of what the winter's been so far. And then also we're going to talk a little bit about what's yet to come. So today to do that for us, we're going to have Megan Jones, who's one of our local climate experts here at the Bismarck office. Also, kind of as an added bonus towards the end, we're going to have our hydrologist, Schlag. He's going to talk a little bit about the spring flood potential. So that's kind of the layout for the webinar here today. Some of the ground rules kind of up front. Everybody will be on mute throughout the duration of the webinar. If you do have any questions, there will be time for questions towards the end of the webinar. There is a questions box. I would really encourage you to use that. It seems like that works very well most of the time. But if you aren't able to do that and you would like to verbally ask your question as well, all you would have to do is raise your hand for us, and that'll signal to us that you'd like to ask a question. Then what we'll do is we'll unmute you, and then you'll also have to unmute yourself. It looks like most times, once we do it, folks are still on mute and have to do kind of a local unmuting for your own audio. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Megan Jones, who's again our local climate expert here. She's going to talk about the winter so far and what's yet to come, and maybe a little bit about what spring's going to look like. So with that, Megan, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Corey, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. As Corey said, my name is Megan. I'm one of the meteorologists here at the National Weather Service office in Bismarck. I'm also the local climate services lead, so I try to cover all things climate. This is our first time doing a midwinter update. We did the initial winter outlook webinar in late October. It seemed like people were interested in getting an update about halfway through the winter, so that's why we're here today. Since it's our first one, if you have any comments or feedback about what we could be, other information we could be giving you all, please let us know. We're relatively new to this kind of expanded climate outreach in DSS. So we're really just trying to learn what you all want and need from us. So just to start, a quick recap. This was the December, January, February outlook that was published in October of 2023. So this was the official winter outlook that we talked about on the first webinar. In terms of temperatures on the left, we were favored for above normal temperatures for that December, January, February time period, the meteorological winter. And looking at precipitation on the right, we were favored for below normal precipitation, especially in western into north central North Dakota. So to look at what's been going on so far, so for temperatures, this is the average temperature departure from mean. On the left, we start at October 1st, so kind of the start of the cold season. And on the right, we start at December 1st, so the start of meteorological winter. They look pretty similar. In both of them, we have had above average temperatures across the state. Since October, it's been kind of 1 to 4 degrees above normal. If we're looking just from December until yesterday, much stronger anomalies, especially as you get out into eastern North Dakota, getting into that 6, 7, maybe even 8 degrees above normal. And this does include the really impressive cold snap we had a couple weeks ago. And that has really been completely canceled out by the warm temperatures we've had the rest of this winter season so far. So definitely well above average, which is what we were expecting. In terms of precipitation, this is the accumulated precipitation percent of mean. Again, on the left, this is since October 1st, so the start of the water year in the cold season. And on the right, since December 1st, so again, meteorological winter. If we're looking since October 1st, you can see in both the northwest and the southeast corners of the state, we're anywhere from 100 to 150-ish% of normal. And in the middle part of the state, this gold color is this 50 to 75% of normal, and this light yellow is 75 to 100% of normal. So a decent part of the state, less precipitation than average. Definitely a different picture if we look at just since December 1st. You can see most of the state, especially the west and the north into the central parts of the state, below normal. We're getting even these pockets in the southwest and in the north central of this orange color that's 25 to 50% of normal. very different once we look at the southeast part of the state. We've got this corner of 200 to 300% of normal precipitation since December 1st. And if you somehow managed to forget what happened in December, we had that very significant ice storm right after Christmas. And so parts of the James River Valley into the southeast parts of the state got a lot of precipitation with that. Some places it was only ice, but I know especially in the southeast that eventually turned to rain. And so they did end up getting a lot of liquid precipitation with that, but not snow. So interesting to look then at the seasonal snow that we've received so far this winter. If we're looking at the accumulated snowfall since October 1st, places west and north have gotten a little bit more. Generally kind of in that 20 to 27 inch range or so. Bismarck is at 15.6 as of today. Then you can see as we get into the southeast part of the state, not a whole lot of snow. And we really see that stand out in the departure from mean, which is over here on the right. We've got a few places out west and getting into the northwest and north central that's maybe right around normal, maybe slightly above normal. But the majority of the state is kind of in this 5 to 10 to 15 inches below normal, especially again looking at the southeast part of the state, 15 to 20 inches below normal, which again, if that December storm had been snow instead of ice, things might be looking pretty different. But unfortunately, that was not the case. And so they did get the precipitation, but not a lot of snow for that part of the state so far this winter. For looking at the current snow depth on the top and the current snow water equivalent on the bottom, there's not a lot out there. You can see in northeast and the north central parts of the state, maybe some places with over 4 inches of snow on the ground, maybe some places with 1 to 2 inches of water equivalent. But I think as we've seen, it's been very warm the past couple of days. We've really managed to melt off a lot of that snowpack. So most parts of the state really don't have any snow depth and really not much of snow water equivalent there. But I'll leave the rest of the hydro talk to Alan later on in the presentation. So just to briefly recap why things are going the way they're going. And if you were on our initial Winter Outlook webinar, you'd remember some of this because we did talk about it kind of at length. The El Nino Southern Oscillation has been the main driver of climate so far this winter. And this is a large-scale climate pattern based on sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean. And there's this interaction between the ocean and the atmosphere. So right now we are in the warm phase of El Nino. For the previous 3 winters before this one, we were in the cold phase, which is known as La Nina. So that is going basically about as expected. The El Nino is going strong. This graph shows the monthly sea surface temperature index values for the past 2 winters. You can see in the winter of 2022 and 2023, those sea surface temperature anomalies were negative. That was the La Nina. And you can see ever since then, it has been climbing pretty significantly up until right now, and we're reaching the peak of the El Nino, which was as expected. This is historically when the El Nino peaks. As far as how strong this event is, the threshold for a very strong El Nino event is +2 degrees. If we're looking at the November, December, January period, to get that threshold, you have to average 3 months together. So all we need for January is +1.9 degrees or higher, and then that 3-month period of November, December, January, that will qualify as a very strong El Nino. So definitely, we get El Nino events relatively frequently, but this would only be, I think, the 4th very strong El Nino event since 1950. So pretty rare in terms of strength. And in terms of, the typical winter impacts, again, we've talked about this before. When we have an El Nino ongoing in the winter, the Pacific jet stream shifts south, leads to an amplified storm track over the southern U.S., whereas we are favored for above normal temperatures in the north central U.S. A stronger El Nino doesn't mean stronger impacts, but it does mean a higher likelihood of the expected pattern occurring. And again, I think we've seen that, we're borderline strong, very strong El Nino event ongoing. And we've certainly been seeing those warmer than normal temperatures. We showed these at the October webinar as well. So again, just a quick recap, the average temperature departure during November through March for all the El Nino years since 1940, if you average them out, most of North Dakota is in that +2 to +3 degrees Fahrenheit range. Over here on the right, we like to look at the count because sometimes if you're blending together all your anomalies, some signals can get washed out. So looking at the count, you can see favored in southwest North Dakota. That's where you have the strongest count of the number of El Niños with above average temperatures. But again, it's a relatively consistent signal across the state to typically get warmer than normal temperatures during the entire cold season of November through March. Looking at seasonal snowfall, the percent of average snowfall is over here on the left. Again, a very consistent signal across the northern plains, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Montana, typically in the 75 to 95% of average snowfall. That's this yellow shading. But again, we can get a little more information if we look at the actual count. So over here on the right, the number of El Niños with above average snowfall. You can see in parts of the west and central, this orange color, only 6 to 8 of those 29 El Niños had above average snowfall. So in terms of frequency, not super likely. Interesting that as you get towards the southeast part of the state, maybe closer to a 50-50 split, but of course those are, it's a part of the state that has the least amount of snowfall as of today. So if we look at the 8 strong El Nino years that we've had since 1950, it can be kind of overwhelming and a little messy to look at all the data, but I think there were some important things that we realized once we looked at everything together. So we've got the seasons over here on the far left. We talked about the seasonal snowfall and the December, January, February temperatures back in October. Seasonal snowfall, for the most part, skews below normal, but not always. And wintertime temperatures, for the most part, skew warm, but not always. One of the things we're looking at now over here in this column is the last measurable snowfall and when that occurs in the spring season. The 1991 to 2020 average date is April 18th, so kind of right in the middle of spring. If you're just looking at all the dates individually, it's anywhere from March 15th to May 11th, which is a 2-month span that is maybe not the most helpful. But if you start looking at it a little bit, breaking it down a little bit, so these 3 years that have the little arrow next to it, those are the 3 strong El Niños that were directly out of a La Nina, which is what happened to us this winter. If you look at those, that suggests that El Nino events directly out of a La Nina have the last measurable snow near or later than normal, so near normal to later than normal in the spring. But then we look at 3 other years. Those are the super El Niños. Those are the years that have the star next to it. And if you look at that, the super El Nino event suggests that the last measurable snowfall is near normal or earlier than normal in the spring. And since we are, really close to a super El Nino, but also directly out of a La Nina, maybe not the most helpful, although that would maybe suggest that if you kind of blend the 2 together, that maybe we'll be right around normal. So we'll have to see, but not the most conclusive, but it was interesting enough. Thought we would show it. Then if we turn to look at spring temperatures as well as February, March, April snow and precipitation, you can see again for spring temperatures, for the most part, it skews warm, which is what we were expecting. The snow and the precipitation is where there's some really useful information here, I think. Again, if we're looking at snow, most of the time, it's near to below normal, especially. Normal for those 3-month periods for Bismarck is 20.6 inches. But it's not quite the same if you look at the actual precipitation amounts. And I think that's one of the key points we want to get across, is that below normal snowfall doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be dry. If we're looking at the last 3 strong El Nino events, especially 97, 98, 2009, 2010, and 2015, 2016, all 3 of those have at least near normal precipitation. 97, 98 is near normal. Then we look at the 2 most recent strong El Nino events, and that February, March, April precipitation is almost 200% of normal. So, very far from dry, and interesting because they had very different snow amounts. And I think we've learned up here, again, with the ice storm we just had, you can be pretty close in temperatures and get very different results. So it can be really dependent on what the atmosphere is doing at that point. If it falls as, snow versus rain versus hopefully not ice. But as our hydrologist likes to talk about, we've been in a wet cycle for the past 20 years or so. And I think you're really seeing this in this data, that there's definitely a wet pattern in the spring when we're looking at these El Nino events. So again, we might have below normal snowfall, but that does not mean that it's going to be dry. This is very timely. This is the increased risk of temperature extremes. Over here On the left, this is for November, December, January. Over here on the right, this is for February, March, April, and this is the risk of temperature extremes during El Nino. Very fitting today because the last we had looked, we had already beaten the high temperature record at Dickinson by a few degrees, and we were, threatening the all-time record for January. So, and it's, very not normal to see, but just looking at this increased risk of warm extremes, it's a really strong signal across the entire region for this November, December, January period that, we get warm extremes. It's not unusual at all during an El Nino winter. The other important thing I wanted to show these is that it's very different the first half of winter or the cold season compared to the second half. So again, this is November, December, January on the left. You can see a really consistent signal across the entire northern plains, really high percent increase in the risk of warm extremes. By the time you get to February, March, April, that signal really decreases, especially for western into south central North Dakota. That's a much weaker signal than you had the first half of winter. The strongest signal ends up being in eastern North Dakota and into Minnesota, but again, that signal is significantly decreased. So another kind of key point for us is even if the second half of winter ends up warmer than normal by the books, we're not expecting it to be as warm as the first half of winter was. December for Bismarck was 10.5 degrees above normal, which is very impressive. But again, we're not expecting that significant of temperature anomalies for the second half of winter, even though it might end up above normal, but definitely not quite as extreme as the first half of winter. We see a similar sort of shift when we're looking at the increased risk of precipitation extremes. And again, El Nino and La Nina both aren't quite as influential on precipitation in this part of the country, but there's still some things we can take from the data. So again, over here on the left, November, December, January, you can see that there's a pretty substantial dry signal out in Montana, in Wyoming, and into the western half of North Dakota. And Alan will talk about this here soon, some of the data we're seeing from there. And then if we look at February, March, April on the right, you can see that dry signal really shifts off to the east, into north central, northeast North Dakota, out into Minnesota and Wisconsin. So again, they're very different halves to the season. We tend to just kind of lump the entire winter season together. But I think we're seeing in the data, and we've seen with experience that the first half of winter can be very different than the second half of winter. So in terms of talking about, maybe a more active second part to the winter, it seemed fitting to kind of start going through some of the outlooks and starting with the 6 to 10 day, which I know is relatively soon. But if you haven't looked at the forecast too recently, definitely starting to get more active. I think we have chances for rain starting this weekend. So in the 6 to 10 day temperature outlook, you can see, a significant warm signal. This is valid for February 4th through 8th, but then we are starting to get much more active with above normal precipitation favored as well. So just in time for that February, March, April period, definitely some signs through the next couple of weeks for more active periods setting up. If we're looking at weeks 3 to 4, so this is kind of the bulk of February. This is the weeks 3 to 4 temperature outlook over here on the left. You can see the majority of the state is just in this equal chances category. So pretty different than the normal warm signal that we've been seeing for really the past couple of months. And that's really driven by the long-term temperature trends. If you've lived here long enough, I'm sure you kind of realize that February always seems to be really cold, not a lot of fun if you don't like cold. And it's really driven from these temperature trends. And so it can be hard for climate forecasters just because you've got the influence of the El Nino ongoing, but it can also be really hard to kind of cancel out some of these longer term temperature trends that are pretty significant. So the second half of February, especially, even if it's not cold, at this point, not expecting it to be, warmer than normal, like what we've been seeing lately. So that's something to keep an eye out for. That concern with the cooling trend really extends through the spring season. And spring is really hard forecast wise. It's a transition season, but also we've got a pretty modest cooling signal across the northern plains, especially North Dakota. And that signal is conflicting with the warmth that we are expecting from El Nino. As the El Nino kind of starts to fade, it's going to be really conflicting with this longer term cooling trend. And at this point, not a lot of confidence in which one's going to play out. And that goes back to, even if we end up above normal, it is not likely to be the above normal that we've been seeing for the first half of winter, but it's probably going to be a much more muted warming signal if it ends up warmer than normal at all. So as we look at our seasonal temperature outlooks, this is for February, March, April. Over here on the right, this is the temperature outlook. You can see that, you know, some orange shading, but this is, you know, just in the leaning above category. It's not substantially favored for above normal. And the precipitation outlook on the right, equal chances, so not a strong signal for us either way, although some signs that the central US is going to be more active, so that could potentially extend up into North Dakota at times. And again, if we're looking at our pie charts for South Central North Dakota, you can see this is not a very high probability of above normal. It can be a little misleading because you see this image and you go, oh, okay, warm colors, it's going to be warm. But really, once you dive into the data, 36% chance of above normal, but a 31% chance of below normal, and then 33% chance of near normal. So a very slight tilt, but overall, not too much confidence in what that temperature pattern is going to end up being, again, because we've got the conflicting effects of El Nino compared to the long-term temperature trends. A similar pattern exists in the March, April, May, the official spring season outlook. Again, slightly favored towards above normal temperatures, not much in the way of the precipitation outlook, equal chances for above near normal over low normal. And then finally, as we get to April, May, June, getting more towards late spring into summer, we start to see much more of that equal chances in terms of temperatures. And we also see that in the precipitation as well. So as that El Nino starts to fade, not a whole lot from the temperature and precipitation outlooks as we get into early summer. So enough with the outlook. Now I'm going to turn it over to Alan, our hydrologist, to talk about some of the hydro concerns.
Okay, well, thanks, Megan. So without, I guess, a lot of surprise, it's that time of the year again. My phone's been ringing. People have been inquiring as to what we're going to experience this coming spring. I've had the media in here a few times doing stories, trying to figure out what's going to take place this spring. So I figured we'll bring this to you so you kind of have an idea of what I'm thinking. But first and foremost, let me let y'all know the official spring flood outlook series begins February 15th. So we'll be issuing the first issuance, I guess, of the spring flood outlook on, again, February 15th. So right now, as Megan was denoting, you know, we are running out of snow very quickly around here. It has been very warm as of late throughout most of North Dakota. And here in the Bismarck area, which is really pretty emblematic of what we see throughout at least central North Dakota and at least extending up into those first tier counties below Canada and all the way over into the James River Basin and again into southwestern part of the state, we're burning off snowpack very quickly. Now, what that is doing is it is wetting up our soils. We actually have been seeing some runoff in some of our smaller streams. The James River Basin, we've seen some runoff entering the James River up by Grace City. Here in the Bismarck area, we're seeing a little bit runoff entering in Apple Creek. And again, in the southwestern part of the state, the Hart River, the Cedar Creek, and Cannonball have all been slightly active over the last few days. Big thing is there's not a lot of water driving this, okay? But the ground conditions are terrible. There is no other way to shake that. With the little bit of moisture that we've got coming off now, maybe we had a 1/4 inch of snow water equivalent in many of these areas, and it is efficiently melting that and not allowing it to soak into the ground. So I think with the current snow melt that we're seeing, we're going to expand these very poor, pronounced impermeable soil conditions across much of the state for the rest of the spring or much of this winter going into spring. All right, so right now surface soil moisture by all accounts, especially if you look at the root zone, they will sometimes show a dry portion in the state. And most of the times when I start talking about soil moisture, I am indeed talking about the upper 100 centimeters. Today, however, we're only looking at the upper 10 centimeters of the soil in this image on the left. And the reason for that is because the rain that came in December, paired up with the most recent snow melt, it's not making it very far into the ground. It is getting trapped in those upper few inches of the soil and making it fairly immobile. A little bit has come running off, but for the time being, we are going to have very wet, frozen, impermeable soils. Okay. The Missouri River snowpack, as what we see on the right here, we are just now reaching the bare minimum of what we've seen over the last 30 years. You look at that green line, that is the minimum snow water content in the total watershed above Fort Peck. On the right-hand side, that is total from Fort Peck up to Garrison, okay? So we see we're just now clawing our way back up to near normal, or I'm sorry, not normal, near the 30-year minimum. So it is very, very dry out in Montana right now. Skiers not liking it. And again, here in North Dakota, if you like cross-country skiing and stuff, not a great year for it. So most sites in North Dakota, you know, between 6 and 15 inches of snow received this winter. The numbers that Megan was talking about earlier goes all the way back to the water year in October. Well, of course, you remember back in October, we had a pretty good snow event. So that kind of inflated the actual seasonal, or not the seasonal, but the actual water year total for snow received. Most of the times when I start talking about snow, I'm interested in what gets accumulated and is sitting on the ground, hopefully until we hit spring melt. Well, the very warm January, of course, that we've just had here the last few days, we're burning that off, and the accumulation season will have to kind of start all over again. But nonetheless, we are certainly well below normal. Drought concerns. This is something that I think is at least a concern going forward. You know, with those wet soils frozen, we're still getting below freezing at night. We are susceptible to an early spring rain. I don't think anybody is going to be forecasting a large rain event anytime in the next few weeks. But if we continue to maintain this hard frozen ground, which I suspect we will, going into the month of March, that's where we run the risk of a large rain event coming in, and that can create flood problems. That's primarily where my concerns are with flooding. On the flip side of that coin, though, if we don't have large rain events or considerable snowpack going into March, drought is really going to take front stage going into this spring. Okay, the overall soil columns, as I talked about earlier, they're a little bit drier than what we're looking at in the surface soils. So for the time being, we have slowly seen an expansion of D0 across a couple of counties in that central part of the state. But for the most part, the U.S. Drought Monitor has been fairly patient, allowing this moisture deficit to exist, but without significant impacts. They're not inclined to change the drought monitor right now. That will most likely develop very quickly, though, as we get closer and closer to the spring melt season. If we don't have the snow on the ground, I would expect to see these drought conditions start degrading fairly quickly across the state. Okay, so the shallow snowpack is certainly an indicator of worsening of drought conditions come the spring. And of course, if we have no moisture sitting on the ground, as soon as we start getting warm enough air temperatures to dry out that vegetation above ground, that could lead to a more active and perhaps an earlier than normal spring fire season. So that certainly bears keeping in mind as we go into March, that if we keep warm temperatures in the forecast, it won't take long for it to dry out the vegetation. So at this point, the lack of snow water equivalent on the ground suggests that it would be difficult, if this trend continues, to generate much runoff during the spring melt season. Again, the wetting of the ground in December and now in January with the snow melt has left a large area of the state with soil conditions very favorable to producing unusually high amounts of runoff from a given rain event. So by that, you know, if we receive a ½ inch of rain and you're internally kind of calibrated as to what to expect to see in the rivers from a ½ inch of rain, it would very much surprise most of us with the amount of runoff that would be generated right now. Conversely, the current trend in precip would suggest that an easier path really does exist to a worsening of the drought conditions. So it's still too early to rule out which way we're going to go, but at this point, I would think the drought would be an easier path to go. Nonetheless, under either path, weather during the middle of February and early March is likely to play a really large role in determining the direction we go this spring. Either we're going to add to the suite, as Megan mentioned, we're going to get a little bit more active, but that's far enough out in the future right now to where we're not having any idea as to the actual volume of precip that be coming. It's just that the probability for getting precip is going to rise as we go into early February. So either we add more to the suite or we have near barren ground. Obviously, those are only two choices. But the key thing here to keep in mind is that we don't usually lose much of our frost depth until early to mid-March. That's kind of where we hit our zenith for frost depth. And by then, daytime average temperatures start whittling away at a little bit from the surface. But more importantly, the warm ground underneath that frost starts removing it from the bottom. And that usually starts taking place roughly around mid-March. And then by early April, all of the frost tends to be gone. Back to Megan.
Okay, thanks, Alan. So just a quick summary of what we're expecting after we talked about all this. For temperatures, you know, a very slight tilt towards above normal temperatures for the rest of the, you know, the winter, cold season into the spring. But again, we're not expecting this to be significantly warmer than normal compared to the first half of winter when we had those really strong temperature anomalies, especially in December. And of course, still potential to get cold air outbreaks through February and March. As we get later, you know, it definitely becomes less likely, but certainly can't rule it out, especially second half of, you know, February into March, at least maybe a little bit cooler, would not be super surprised. In terms of precipitation, not too much change in the thinking from earlier of our, you know, below normal snow. But again, the lack of snow doesn't mean dry. So just a reminder, the past 3 strong El Niños have had at least normal precipitation during that February, March, April period, with the past 2 being much wetter than normal, close to 200% of normal precipitation. And even if it, you know, even if we end up only near normal for the rest of the cold season, it's going to feel more active just because it's been so dry. So for some fun kind of bonus content, our Sue Chauncey-Schultz has made a local machine learning model. He had it for our initial winter outlook, and he's updated all the stats to see what might happen this spring. So one of the main things, the seasonal snowfall chance of below normal has shifted to 76%. That is taking into account that, you know, we haven't gotten a whole lot of snow this winter so far, so kind of expecting that to continue. If we're looking at precipitation and snowfall for February, March, April, a slight tilt towards above normal, not a strong tilt, but just slight. So maybe some hints that we end up, you know, a little bit more active in that February, March, April period, especially compared to what we've seen this winter so far. And a little bit of a tilt towards below normal temperatures. So this machine learning model maybe favoring the trend a little bit more. But again, it gets pretty hard when you get to the late winter and early spring with the El Niño trying to combat those longer term trends. Then as we go into March, April, May, the precipitation starts to shift towards being favored below normal, which is interesting. For us, that maybe means, you know, maybe more active February, March before we start to get a little less active April into May. And then the temperature is also favored for below normal in March, April, May, although we did want to note that in validation testing, the model does appear to have some cold bias with forecasting March, April, May temperatures. So we'll have to see how this all turns out at the end of the cold season. And finally, in case you were curious, this is the ENSO probabilistic strength forecast. These red bars are the probabilities of El Nino conditions. You can see for December, January, February, and January, February, March. So right now the percent chance is 100 because the El Nino event is ongoing. These probabilities decrease very quickly as we go into the spring and summer. You can see these gray bars become the largest. That's the probability of ENSO neutral conditions, so kind of our transition in between phases. And then the blue bars start to increase. That's the probability of La Nina conditions returning. Again, not given. We are getting above 60% by the time we get to August, September, October. It is pretty normal, honestly, to go from an El Nino right back into a La Nina. This is, that is what typically happens. So there is potential for a La Nina watch to be issued during the next 2 months. So if you start seeing some mention of that, we wanted you to hear it from us first, that is certainly a possibility. And just as a reminder, if you forgot what typically happens during a La Nina, typically we have that warmer than normal fall before we have a pretty abrupt switch to winter temperatures, and then winter temperatures do tend to linger into the spring season. Not too much of a trend in terms of precipitation, but before this winter we did have 3 La Nina winters in a row. They all looked a little bit different, but again, that warm fall before a quick switch into winter is what we typically see with a La Nina. So we'll have to see what happens. Figured we would give you a little heads up now before we start to get a better picture in the next couple months of what we can expect for next winter. So that is what we have for our presentation. If you have any climate questions, you can email me. If you have any hydro questions, you should definitely email Alan.
Or Corey.
So if you have any questions, comments, or feedback now, we would be happy to take it.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks, Alan. So again, if you have any questions, go ahead and pop one into the questions box. Otherwise, you can go ahead and raise your hand and we can unmute you. If you're one of our media partners and you'd prefer to, have an interview after the call here is all said and done, just go ahead and reach out to Alan or Megan, and you got the phone number there, and just ask for them. And whoever answers the phone will get you right in contact with one of them. So with that, looking for any questions. I'm not seeing any, so I'm thinking that Megan and Alan, you probably covered everything very, very well. Will there be a tape presentation or graphics be made available? Megan, go ahead and cover that one.
Yes, so we have been recording this presentation, so I'll get it uploaded to our YouTube page, and then I will email out the link to that along with a PDF copy of all of these slides for all of you to have. Good question.
Thank you for that, Ed McIntosh. So we appreciate that. Any other questions? Not seeing anything popping up in the box. I don't see any hands raised. So we'll go ahead and give it another 5 to 10 seconds here and see if anybody's got one. Otherwise, any final words from Megan or Alan here that you wanted to leave us with? Otherwise, we'll go ahead and call it a webinar and let everybody get back to their busy schedules.
When's the hydro webinars?
So the hydro outlook again, Al, maybe that'd be a good
one. Hydro outlooks, the spring flood issue again is February 15th. And I believe, as we've done for quite a few years now, there will be an email that comes out that will allow you to sign up for a webinar associated with that the afternoon after the release.
Awesome. Not seeing any other questions or any hands raised. With that, we'll go ahead and let everybody sign out here today. Again, we thank everybody for this. And again, as Megan said, if you have any feedback, we'd love to hear about that as well. So you can reach out to Megan or Alan. And we look forward to seeing what the rest of the winter and spring brings. So thanks, everybody.